This is the lecture for Monday, the 22nd of February, 2021. This is, of course, period 1 and European history. So, where we were is that on Friday, during the lecture, please pass this back, we encountered China during the early part of its so-called, you're welcome, century of shame. China's basic choice in the 1600s was to step away from the world. There were tendencies of this same choice when 200 years before, in the mid-1400s, after a great tour of the Indian Ocean, the Mandarins ordered the destruction of Shang Ho's treasure fleet rather than continue to explore the world. In effect, the Chinese said, well, there's nobody out here worth talking to because it's done for it. So why should we continue to spend effort trying to explore the world? Now, the Chinese treasure fleet under Shang Ho was fundamentally different from Columbus and Magellan and Vasco da Gama and all the other exploradors from the age of exploration from Europe. What China wanted, and what China always wants, is for the rest of the world to kowtow to it. China, because of its role in East Asian culture, has always seen itself as Zhenghua, the Middle Kingdom, as Zhenghua, the central flowery of culture. As such, what they expect is they expect the rest of the world to acknowledge this symbolically. The kowtow, as you recall, is a personal prostration where you go to your knees and you place your forehead on the floor, and traditionally you do it at least 3 times for an imperial august personage. What China got when it sent Shang Ho out in the 1400s from the various states around the Indian Ocean is they got their symbolic kowtow. The Chinese actually gave richer gifts than they received. But all of the local kings, as far as the Chinese were concerned, had acknowledged the amazing superiority of Chinese culture. And that's what the Imperial Ming wanted. That is what China wanted. And in the 1600s, when the Europeans were proving troublesome, they closed their kingdom off. The Kangxi Emperor, after realizing he couldn't be Pope, as well as the Son of Heaven, realized the Europeans were not going to kowtow. Had they made Kangxi Emperor Pope, then he probably would have accepted it. The history of the world would have been different. But would he have been a genuine Roman Catholic convert? That's a real doubtful proposition. When Europe didn't kowtow, China closed its doors. And when the Europeans knocked again, and 200 years later in the 1800s, with this time industrial technology as well as the European dynamism and drive, the Chinese did not know what to do. So ultimately, they consoled themselves with contempt for the foreign devils, the round-eyed barbarians. And in their consolation, they refused to acknowledge the reality that they had been outclassed. And in refusing to acknowledge reality, they had sealed their own doom. The one thing adults do not want to do, and the one thing necessary for adults to do if they want to survive and prosper, is acknowledge objective reality. Especially when it doesn't please their narrative. All you have to do is look at the way woke culture is so fragile and unconfident that it feels the need to smother any other point of view. Why? Because they're afraid of debate. because they're afraid of robust alternative opinions. Nobody who is truly confident in their beliefs being valid objectively would be so afraid of speech, but they're terrified of it, to the point where they bully generations of college students, and they're spreading out into corporate, into media, into general society, to the point where it's the norm now, if you speak out against them, to be so-called canceled. What a bunch of fragile snowflakes. It really does give me, as a conservative, hope, because they understand that their ideas cannot withstand genuine scrutiny. The Chinese go that route. They deny the reality. And in denying the reality, they deny themselves the opportunity to adapt. The Taiping try to adapt. Ultimately, the imperial government of China acknowledges something they would never admit to by hiring Western mercenaries to defeat the Taiping, which they do at great bloody cost. The ultimate expression of Chinese denial is the Boxer Rebellion, where martial arts masters are pitted against modern soldiers. They get slaughtered. So China is opened up to all. The American insistence on the open door policy under our active President Theodore Roosevelt kept Europe from carving China up. But the price for China's continued unity was a recognition of an ongoing second-class status within their own land, with foreign gunboats up their rivers, with foreign missionaries propagandizing and missionizing their people, and with the traditions of China revealed as not any longer the envy of the world, but primitive and backward, which drove them nuts. But they had no answer yet. The Taiping answer had been rejected for the time. Now, Japan had gone the same route as China in the early 1600s. Why? Well, in the 1500s, Japan was in a century of chaos. We talked a bit about this last unit. Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose up. I did those in wrong order. Silly, stupid me. Okay. The first warlord to take over most of Japan in the 1500s was not Toyotomi Hideyoshi. It was Oda Nobunaga. And what Nobunaga does is he takes over central Japan. Then, when he dies, Hideyoshi takes over most of Japan and invades Korea, the land of the garlic eaters. He dies, but with a child son. Now, up until now, the imperium had been inherited because the Japanese emperor was a lineal descendant of the goddess of the sun, Amaterasu Mikami. But the shogun, which is what Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and ultimately Tokugawa Ieyasu were aiming for, was the military ruler of Japan under the emperor. The emperor reigned, the shogun ruled. But, in fact, what Hideyoshi was trying to do was, before his death, he extorted promises from his chief generals, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, that they would follow his son, who was still a boy. Like the Romans, the Japanese are not going to follow a boy. So, very quickly, the boy dies under mysterious circumstances, and the two chief generals fight, and in the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes the supreme military ruler of Japan and shogun, that is. What I haven't stressed, what I did stress last unit when we talked about this, 2 units ago, was that these battles were increasingly fought with cannons and muskets, not katanas and yumibos. That the tactics and techniques were not of the medieval samurai, where they would meet one another in battle, introduce one another, say their triumphs, and then fight an individual duel among thousands of other samurai fighting individual duels. No, no, no. What was being fought was European-style battles with gunpowder troops, pikemen, cavalry, and artillery. This threatened the system in Japan. In fact, Hideyoshi was lowborn. He was a peasant. He came from peasant stock, and he ended up becoming military ruler of Japan for about 20 years. How is it possible that a lowborn peasant could? Because the gunpowder revolution had come to Japan, and the foreigners were in Japan, the Portuguese particularly, and the Jesuits. And this threatened to destabilize all of Japanese civilization. And if the Japanese insist on anything as a culture, it is a form of unity. Japan is a land of disastrous natural problems, earthquakes, tidal waves, volcanoes. The Japanese people need to function together, and their culture systematically weeds out individualists, troublemakers, criminals, anyone who will stand against the system. The Confucianism of China that when imported to Japan really, really makes sense with the Japanese system. You are supposed to adapt to the flow around you. You are not supposed to stand against it. You are supposed to be a willow, not an oak. So what to do to preserve Japanese civilization in the face of European innovations that threaten to completely upend it? Well, what Tokugawa Ieyasu's son does, very soon after his death, is he orders the foreigners out of Japan, except for once a year the Dutch are allowed to show up in Nagasaki, the only city where Christianity has really dug in. And those Japanese who refused to convert away from Christianity were persecuted, and those European missionaries who refused to leave Japan were crucified en masse. So Japan in the early 1600s did precisely what China did, closed themselves off against the world. However, Japan is located in an area of the Pacific that gets a lot of seaborne trade because of the way Great Circles routes work. Anyone going from the Philippines even, let alone the Chinese coast, to somewhere in North America, is going to pass Japan. And off the Japanese coast in the Pacific Ocean are the worst storms on Earth. Typhoon, supreme wind. The typhoon make hurricanes look medium-sized. And the waters off of Japan are rife with all sorts of rocks and problems. So for 200 years, mariners from around the world would wash up on Japan's shores and get sliced and diced by the samurai. The samurai simply didn't put up with foreigners landing. Any foreigner who landed in Japan suffered a death sentence. More and more, these foreigners were Americans. Now, what the Tokugawa Shogunate practiced within Japan was a form of cultural stasis. They actually succeeded at Metternich's idea because of the nature of Japanese culture more than Metternich could have possibly dreamed. The samurai became ritual knights. They became obsessed with the Arthurian legend of Japan, the legend of Musashi, who is the ultimate perfect samurai who lives just after the Tokugawa established themselves. And this is a knight errant who goes around Japan doing good deeds, being honorable at all costs. That's the story of Musashi. So Japan becomes a society where there's no progress, where you're born into your role. Art takes the form of no place. The secret world of the geisha is a place of great entertainment and culture. It's not just a brothel for sex. The geisha are trained in poetry, in calligraphy, in the other refined arts. And to spend an evening with a top flight geisha means you are going to experience across the board an evening of delight and entertainment. Again, not purely physical, but also cultural. There's the kabuki plays, where they wear the incredible makeup, and where fighting skills become more and more the stylized dance and duel. But in 1853, an American battle squadron under Commodore Matthew Perry steams in, because they have steam engines on these wooden warships, to Tokyo Bay. A host of Marines land with basically Civil War era rough rifled muskets. Cannon on the ships herald the arrival, firing salutes, but also letting the Japanese know their power. And as Perry marches ashore to meet with the Japanese representative of the Tokugawa Shogunate, the Japanese nation realized they effed up big time. Because the purpose of the Japanese nation is to protect and serve the God Emperor in the land of the awakened gods. This is the heart of Shinto. It is part of being Japanese, and they had failed. Had Matthew Perry wanted to, he could have shelled and destroyed the Imperial Palace. Had Matthew Perry wanted to, he could have sent his Marines to the Imperial Palace and captured the Emperor, just as Cortez and Pizarro captured Montezuma and Atahualpa. That Perry didn't do these things, from the Japanese perspective, was a grace and a reprieve and an opportunity. Perry leaves a message. He says he'll be back in a few months, and the message is that Japan must open up and that negotiations must begin so that our sailors stop getting butchered by your samurai whenever they are unfortunate enough to get capsized in a storm. In fact, that it would be better for Japan and the people of the world for Japan to open itself up to the rest of the world. I'll be back in about a year. And Perry leaves. And the Japanese have a serious problem. They have allowed themselves to become outclassed. But when Perry returns and the deal is accepted, and the Tokugawa shoguns begin signing a series of unequal treaties, allowing Americans and later Europeans to come into their land, the Japanese attitude is, fine, we deserve this. Good. Because what we are going to do is we are going to become more European than the Europeans. The Europeans develop firearms, we are going to copy them, and we are going to outdo them. The French and later the Germans have mastered land warfare in the modern sense. We will bring in French and then German advisors to redesign our army. The shogunate becomes incapable of serving Japan's interests because the shoguns are concerned about preserving the prerogatives of samurai, of the Japanese knightly class. Can't be done. So the Emperor Meiji is credited with leading a restoration of imperial power and displacing the shogun. Really what happens is that the Japanese people, in the name of the emperor, depose the shoguns and replace the shogun with a modern British-style prime minister, a modern British-style parliament called the Diet, and basically they import Britain's government, Germany's army, Britain's navy, and America's industry. In the middle to late 1800s, Japan utterly changes. Now, those Japanese that don't go along with it commit seppuku, which is ritual suicide, or they commit suicide by modern army. There's the great story of the fight of a group of samurai that refuse to go along with this new way of living and they started a hopeless rebellion. Please close the shade, shut the fan off. Lights too, please. The Swedish rock band Sabaton, which specializes in historical movies, did a song about these last samurai that we are going to see some of, assuming, of course, I turn the volume up. That's a good idea. It's the nature of time, the old ways must give in.